Shalom, I'm Rabbi Stanley from Torah Ministries and Beit Aveinu. Today's teaching takes us back to Kentucky in 1825. It was in Kentucky that a Jewish woman named Zerelda Elizabeth Cole was born in Woodford County. That's less than 100 miles from where I was based at Fort Knox, Kentucky in the Army. Many Ashkenazi Jews whose last name was Cohen took on the name Cole here in the States while trying to escape persecution. Sadly, Zerelda's father, James Cole, who had earlier fought in the Revolutionary War, he was killed in a horse accident when she was only 2 years old. Zerelda came from a prominent family in Kentucky, well-to-do since they were in the alcohol business, which was very typical for Jews during that time. They were in the alcohol business. Her grandfather owned the famous Black Horse Inn and Tavern. So she was sent to a Catholic school when she was 14 to get an education, a good education. In 1839, although her family had actually come from a Baptist background years before. So they were Jews, Jewish by bloodline. Then they became Christians and had joined the Baptist church. But there weren't any Baptist schools in their area. So the best school that they could find actually happened to be a Catholic school. When Zerelda was 16, she met the Reverend Robert James at a revival meeting. He was also a convert from Judaism to Christianity. He was in his early 20s and attending college at Georgetown, there in Kentucky. He became a respected Baptist preacher and helped organize the William Jewell College, which still runs to this day. He also became the pastor of the New Hope Baptist Church, which is now called the New Direction Church, still to this day. It's still functioning. And it can even be found on Facebook. Robert James was orphaned at 9 years of age when his parents were killed. His older sister, Mary Mims is also a Jewish name, took Robert to raise with her own children. Soon after Robert and Zerelda were married, they moved to Clay County, Missouri. That's when he had become the pastor of this church, New Hope Church there. And Robert James was big on education. He was also Jewish, comes from a Jewish background. Jews are very big on education. So he went back to Kentucky for some more schooling, for some more education. And while he attempted to return in time for the birth of their first child, he was prevented by the early freezing of the Missouri River. So they wanted to get back, but he couldn't. His wife had the baby. It was a baby boy, and they named him Alexander. He was born on 10th of January, 1842, but his father, Robert, did not see him until the spring of 1843. After their second son, they had a daughter who they named Susan. Well, the father, Robert, then heard about the gold rush, and he decided he was make his way west, and his goal was to preach to all the gold miners there in California. However, Robert died on the 18th of August in 1850 at a gold camp called Hangtown. It's now called Placerville. It's in California. He died of food poisoning. So Zerelda Cole was now alone. And she found it very difficult, especially back in those days, raising the children on her own. So she married a second time to a man named Benjamin Sims. Benjamin was cruel, however. I mean, you look at the picture, he doesn't look like a friendly guy. And he was cruel to her children, so Zerelda left him. Soon after, Benjamin died in a horse accident, and that's the last that we hear of him in history. Zerelda Cole, now Zerelda Cole Sims, married a third time to Reuven Shmuel. He was another Jewish man who was a doctor. Go figure, a Jewish man being a doctor. He used to rent an office at the general store at Greenville, Missouri. But then Reuven decided to get into the lucrative tobacco industry. Refer back to our teaching on tobacco, by the way, about Jews in the tobacco business. And he did very well there. And he started a plantation. He was wealthy enough to even buy some slaves. Slaves were very expensive back then. And he purchased them to help him and his two stepsons. He got along well with the stepsons. Alexander and his younger brother then began to go, well, Alexander, actually, then began to go by his first name, which was Frank. And his younger brother was named Jesse. These were the now famous Frank and Jesse James, Jewish on both their mother and their father's side. Well, how did two Jewish boys become known as two of the most notorious outlaws in American history? It's not the story that you've generally heard before. I've talked before in other teachings about the Civil War, and that it wasn't because of the issue of slaves, as the modern historians would have you believe. It was about power and money. The North wanted the wealth of the southern plantations, and the South didn't appreciate the North trying to take away many of their rights. After the North won, many in the South were resentful, and they detested the hypocrisy of the Union Army. The Union Army wasn't as good as we've been taught. They were bad on both sides. There was bad things on the Confederate side. There was bad things on the northern side. The Union soldiers in his area, in a lot of parts of the South, they paraded around as if they were the saviors of black slaves. But have you ever heard of the Devil's Punch Bowl in Natchez, Mississippi? Most people haven't. There's a black writer named Angela Grant. She's a doctor turned author, and she writes about the Devil's Punch Bowl. Here's what she writes. Quote, in the 1860s, untold numbers of freed slaves were forced into American concentration camps as they made their way to freedom. They were rounded up, some lynched, killed, and many forced back into hard labor and subjected to torture. These contraband camps were hastily built next to Union Army camps. There was more than one. Yes, Union Army. The same group of men who claimed to be fighting to free slaves in the name of humanity. She goes on. Did you know that the Union Army subjected the free slaves to even worse things than slavery, as if that could be fathomed? Our official educators and the mainstream media have intentionally buried this story, and very little detailed information is readily available on searching. This is not surprising, she says, as it casts the Union Army in a new light, plus makes one reevaluate the real motive for the Civil War instead of the fairy tale fed to our children. These camps were this is her still writing, in Natchez, Mississippi, located in an area known as the Devil's Punch Bowl. Here, this number is staggering. Here, over 20,000 freed slaves died in this Union Army concentration camp. These men, women, and children not even given a proper burial. Shovels were left for the living to bury the bodies where they dropped. Can you imagine bodies buried in the camp where men, women, and children where they thousands begged right where they were living, and thousands begged to return to slavery? Of course they did. The Devil's Punch Bowl is proof of how much worse the North was more than the South ever was. This was a picture taken inside the Devil's Punch Bowl. The Southerners knew all along what the war was about, especially the Jewish Southerners. There was a lot of Jewish Southerners. So what happened was many of these young men became guerrillas. Not this kind of guerrilla. They became militiamen. And it was a noble thing. The South was full of high-ranking Jews. These guys basically just kept fighting even though the war was declared to be over. Many of the Union soldiers persecuted the Southerners after the war. So many of the Southerners fled the United States. The American Civil War left regions of the United States utterly devastated. We always get these pictures where it looks like you have one army on this side and the other army on the other side in a big field, and they all just start shooting. No, they went through the cities and destroyed the cities. Most of that devastation was located in the southern states that made up the Confederacy, like in this picture. Also in this one. And in this one, you see the entire city was just destroyed. It was a brutal war. You might find this surprising, but many Southerners fled to Brazil, mostly the Jewish Southerners. They went specifically to Sao Paulo. I've done another teaching because I've been down in Brazil, spent quite a bit of time down there, and they have a museum down there that about Jews in Brazil, and Brazil was full of Jews. But not all the Southerners went there. Others went west in the United States and tried their fortune in the western states. Well, Frank and Jesse James decided they were going to stay and fight for their home. One of these times of persecution hit home at Jesse and Frank. They'd been working with their stepfather, the one that had been a doctor and was good to them. But then he then became a tobacco farmer. This was during their time when they had just started in the militia. And some Union soldiers came by when the boys were gone, and they tortured the stepfather to try and make him tell where they were. But he wouldn't give in. He wouldn't give them up. So they ended up murdering him. They murdered Frank and Jesse James' stepdad. So the Union had murdered their mom's husband, this doctor, and they took this very personally. And that's when Frank and Jesse got really mad. We have to understand these weren't bad men. Now, I have a shocking fact for you near the end of this teaching. I'll tell you one right now. Even while hiding out from the authorities, while they were visiting their old friends there in Kentucky, Frank James taught Sunday school at the New Salem Baptist Church in Deepsville, near Samuel's Depot. These men weren't bad like they've been painted out to be. In fact, the common people in their area that knew them, they saw them as their modern-day Robin Hood, and even called him that. Makes me wonder if they knew about the bloodline of the famous Reuben Hood. You can look up that teaching in our yeshiva as well. So the James brothers didn't do many of the things that they were accused of. Now, here's the other shocker. After Jesse was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford, and we'll talk about Robert Ford next. But after he was murdered by Ford, Jesse's brother, Frank, turned himself in 3 months later. You know what the law did to the famous Frank James after he turned himself in? They released him. They let him go because they didn't have any evidence. No evidence against the James brothers. They released him. He looks very Jewish in this picture, doesn't he? The Pinkertons were not happy. They were the ones that were after Frank and Jesse. Because when the Pinkertons tried to buy up their land and put pressure on the Union Army to confiscate all their property, that's when Frank and Jesse hit back. And I'm not saying they didn't rob some of the trains, some of the banks, but that was money that had been put in there by the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons wanted them, not the law. Sometimes they were able to force the law's hand. But when it came down to it, the law knew they didn't have any evidence. So they weren't happy, but because there wasn't any evidence of the crimes that they tried to pin on Frank and Jesse. He didn't get off on a technicality. They just didn't have any evidence whatsoever, not even a witness. So they let him go. He was a free man. Now, he did spend a year in jail waiting for that trial, but at the trial, he was acquitted of all charges. So then what did Frank do? Did he go back into a life of crime? If he was a criminal, that's what you'd expect, but no. He became a shoe salesman. After that, he moved here to Washington State and picked berries for a local farm. After he became an old man, he went back to his childhood home and he gave tours to his house to tourists. That's how he spent the remainder of his days. But back to Robert Ford. Now, there was a rotter. He wanted Jesse James, he wanted to become an outlaw earlier on because he had heard all these myths and fables and he wanted some notoriety for himself. But Frank and Jesse, they knew it was all hype. But they still let him run some innocent errands for them from time to time just to make Ford feel like a big man. But then Ford actually killed a man. Nothing related to Frank or Jesse. It was a completely separate incident. But he murdered a man named Wood Height. Ford then took Wood Height into the forest and buried him in a shallow grave. Well, when the law heard about this, they caught him, and they were going to hang him. But that's when Bob Ford turned on Jesse. He was their cousin. He turned on Jesse and Frank and made a deal with the mayor, not the police, the mayor, that if he killed Jesse, they would let him go and give him the reward money from the Pinkertons. Well, for political reasons, this would be a huge feather in the cap of a mayor to be known as the one who got Jesse James. True, the ones who knew Jesse knew he was a good guy. But outside of those circles, way further out, where this mayor was running, the public believed all the stories. So the mayor's ratings would go through the roof. So they made the deal with Bob the Snake Ford. And as you know, he shot Jesse in the back of the head like a coward. The local people shunned him after this. And of course, he had Frank to worry about now more than anything. Because, he understandably, Frank would want his revenge. So he got out of town very quickly. He only received a fraction of the reward money. The Pinkertons kind of squirreled out of that one. And he only got a little bit of the money. So he ended up going on the road, taking the stage, reenacting and reinventing his cowardly act. Oftentimes the crowd booed him off stage. They thought he was a coward. Well, one day, Ford heard a voice behind him say, "Hello, Bob." As Bob Ford turned around to see who was talking to him, the gunman shot Ford in the neck with a double-barrel shotgun, killing him instantly. Who was the gunman? It was an old friend of Jesse James. Edward O'Kelly was his name. O'Kelly had been a marshal at one time, and he knew Jesse was innocent, and he was also an excellent shot. So like I said, it was the Pinkertons who wanted Jesse and Frank. The law didn't care so much because they knew they didn't have any evidence on them. They wanted someone, the Pinkertons wanted someone to blame, so they picked Jesse and Frank because some of it was they did do some robberies. So they picked Jesse and Frank as their guys. But not only Frank and Jesse did they want, they also wanted the Younger brothers. The infamous Younger brothers of Jackson County, Missouri, sons of a prosperous slave-owning farmer. And that's why the feds wanted them. The Younger brothers had a similar story as Frank and Jesse, similar to their story, except their biological father was murdered by the Union soldiers after the war. Their father had been pro-Union, and he'd even pushed his sons in that direction. But after they murdered him, the sons wanted revenge. The Union tried to take their land, and when they couldn't get it, they destroyed it, making it worthless. And thus the Younger brothers joined the militia against them. Who could blame them? The Union had cost them their farm and their father. And now the Younger brothers wanted their money back. They were going to get their money one way or the other. Like Jesse and Frank, the Younger family was well educated. I couldn't find any links if they were Jewish or not. Actually, I did. Later on, I found out they were Jewish as well. Not all the media believed the hype about the Younger brothers either, or the James brothers. There was one editor, in fact, who believed that the truth should always be told. And he was actually willing to die for that belief if it need be. He knew Jesse and Frank and the Younger brothers, and he always gave an honest assessment. His name was John Newman Edwards. Some of my research came from his newspaper. This is in the pages of the Kansas City Times. Edwards established the James brothers as symbols of ex-Confederates, quote unquote, striking back against perceived corruption, graft, oppression, and criminality of military rule in Missouri. Once he got into a really heated debate with the editor of another newspaper, the St. Louis Journal. This editor had the gall to accuse Edwards of lying in one of his articles. Edwards was indignant and challenged the man to a pistol duel. So they both went outside. They're very angry. They went outside and shot at each other furiously. But neither man was hurt because they weren't very good shots. They were newspapermen. Duels aren't for everybody. So how do we know beyond doubt that Frank and Jesse were Jews? Another big piece of evidence that we have, among everything else that I've shared here, is that their mother and Frank and Jesse had DNA testing done on them. A few years back, not too long ago, there was some question concerning if Jesse and Frank were who they said they were. So they dug them up and they tested them. With 99.9% accuracy, it was determined that the Frank and Jesse James, that they were the sons of Zerelda They then did further testing and found that Zerelda was Ashkenazi Jew and Robert, her husband, was Sephardic, and that the brothers were both a mix of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewry. The next question you may have is, why am I sticking up for Frank and Jesse James? Am I related to them or something? No. My great-grandmother was actually a Pinkerton. I'm sticking up for them because it's the truth. I hope you enjoyed the teaching. Shalom, shalom.